The canyon didn't have a name on any human map. The Vethkara called it the swallowing place, which told you everything you needed to know about what they used it for. It was 3 kilometers deep at the widest point, and the walls breathed. Not metaphorically, something in the mineral composition of the black stone released gases when the temperature dropped, a slow exhalation that came up from the dark in slow, visible columns of vapor, so the chasm always looked like it was exhaling some long, final sigh. No gravity anomaly, no radiation trap, no monster lurking in the substrate, just depth, just darkness. Just the fact that the Vethkara had thrown 63 beings into it over the past decade, and not one had climbed back out. They were particular about documentation. The Vethkara, they counted things. The 64th was a princess. Her name was Velsathis of the Third Convergence House, which sounded like poetry and meant approximately the same thing as a royal title could in a civilization that organized itself around bioluminescent caste markings and contested mathematics. She was 17 by her people's count, which placed her somewhere past adolescence and not quite into the range where her life decisions would be considered fully her own. Her markings, 6 spiraling lines of pale gold that ran from her temples to her jaw, were still completing their second growth cycle, which meant in the court's eyes she was still a child. The court's eyes, in the end, hadn't protected her. They threw her in on a gray morning when the vapor columns were particularly thick, so she couldn't see the walls as she fell and couldn't judge the distance. Only the sound changed. The roar of the wind around her body as she dropped, then the sudden shift in acoustics as the walls narrowed, and the sound bounced back at her in strange harmonics, and she found herself screaming not from fear, but from the sheer physical need to hear something other than the swallowing dark. She hit water. Not stone. Not impact. She hit a cold, dark underground river she didn't know existed, because no one who'd been thrown in before had survived long enough to pass the information up, and the Vethkara's data on the swallowing place was precisely 63 tallied bodies and 0 anomalies. She clawed her way to a surface she couldn't see, choked up water that tasted like iron and something older than iron, and dragged herself onto a ledge of rock by feel alone, and heard from somewhere below her in the absolute dark. "Okay, don't panic. You're on the ledge. Second ledge to be specific, which means you survive the drop, which means you're either very lucky or very dense, and in my experience those aren't mutually exclusive. Are you breathing?" She was breathing. "Good, keep doing that. My name's Decker. I'm going to come to you. Don't move unless you feel the ledge shifting, in which case move, but move toward my voice, not away from it. The drop on the far side of you is another 40 meters, and that one doesn't have water at the bottom." She didn't move. She heard him before she saw any light from him. Careful footsteps on wet stone, the sound of something dragged, a pack maybe, by the rhythm, and what she would later identify as the sound of a person who had been alone in the dark long enough that they'd started narrating their own movements under their breath, just to hear the sound of a voice. "Ledge, ledge, ledge. Second support strut feels solid. Don't trust the left side of the second support strut. It's got give in it." Then a small light bloomed in the dark. Not much of one, a chemical rod, cracked and shaken, producing a watery greenish glow that illuminated about 2 meters of cave in every direction. But in absolute dark, 2 meters feels like daylight. He was not what she'd expected. She hadn't known what to expect. The Vethkara records on human survivors in the swallowing place were empty, because the Vethkara records on everything down here were empty. But she had spent 4 years studying the species her people were attempting to colonize, and in that time she had built up a mental composite of what a human looked like. The composite included things like approximate bilateral symmetry, warm-blooded physiology, a tendency to be smaller than they behaved. The composite had not included a human who had been down here long enough to have grown a beard that reached his chest, who was wearing clothes that had been mended so many times the original material was probably less than 30% of what remained, who was carrying a pack that appeared to be assembled from salvaged alien technology and natural materials in roughly equal proportion, and who looked at her golden cast markings, at her bioluminescent secondary pupils, at the obvious non-human architecture of her face, and said without a single beat of fear, "Huh, your convergence house. I thought they didn't exist anymore." She stared at him. "Your markings," he said, as though this was a normal conversation to be having. "Third spiral pattern. Convergence House used them. I've been trying to learn Veth-Kara social structures from the junk they throw down here." He gestured at the dark around them, and she realized with a slow chill that what she'd taken for natural rock formations were in fact piles of material, organized, sorted, labeled in some script she couldn't read. Salvage. "You're the first convergence house they've thrown in, though. Different political crisis." "My mother," she said. Her voice came out wrong, waterlogged and rough and smaller than it should have been. "My mother opposed the expansion protocol, the Fifth Sector vote. She lost. She died 3 days ago." She stopped. "They said it was natural, her heart. Our kind don't have heart failures at 60 cycles." "No," he agreed. "They don't." He crouched beside her and looked at her with the particular attention of someone assessing injuries, not sentimentality. "Anything broken. The water catches most of it, but the angle matters." "My left wrist." She'd noticed it when she'd been clawing for the ledge. "A hot structural wrongness. It isn't bone, it's the support cartilage. My kind. Healed differently than mine, I know. Any internal damage. Breathing feel normal." She took stock. Her secondary lung, the one built for low oxygen processing, was compensating, which told her the air down here was thinner than the surface. But the primary was intact. Her bioluminescent glands, which processed ambient light, were working overtime in the absence of any input, throwing off faint gold that probably made her look, to his eyes, like something radioactive. "I'm intact," she said. "How long have you been down here?" He considered the question, the way people considered questions when the answer was one they'd made peace with, but still didn't entirely like saying out loud. "Best estimate, 14 months, maybe 16. I've lost some time." He picked up the chemical rod and turned back toward the organized dark. "Come on. Base camp is about 400 meters in. I'll explain everything once you're not sitting on a wet ledge." She stood, her legs held. She followed the small green light into the deeper dark, and she thought, 63 others went in and didn't come out. This man went in and built a base camp. She didn't know yet whether that meant he was surviving, or just dying very slowly with good organizational habits. His name was Decker, Marcus Decker, formerly a geological survey technician working a contract under the Veth-Kara's preliminary resource assessment program. They needed humans with subsurface mapping experience. And there had been, in the early years of the occupation, enough desperate people willing to take the work that they'd had options. He'd been surveying a deep cave system in the Northern Territories when he'd found evidence of something the Veth-Kara very much didn't want found. "What was it?" she asked. They were at base camp now. Which was, she was slowly absorbing, a genuinely remarkable thing. A system of caverns about 2 kilometers into the canyon's sublevel, lit by 3 separate power sources, 2 scavenged from junk the Veth-Kara had thrown in along with their victims, one built by hand from materials she couldn't yet identify, with a water filtration system, a functioning food cultivation area under UV light strips, a medical supply cache, a communications array that was clearly in some stage of construction, and a hand-drawn map covering the entire eastern wall of the largest cavern that was so detailed it looked, at first glance, like professional cartography. He handed her a container of something warm and didn't answer immediately. "Evidence of prior habitation," he said at last. "Not Veth-Kara, not human, something old, the kind of old that changes the calculus on territorial claims." She understood the implication. The Veth-Kara's legal framework for the expansion protocol rested heavily on the premise that the worlds they were absorbing had no prior claim registered to a recognized civilization. If there was evidence of an advanced prior civilization, if this world had been inhabited and then abandoned or destroyed, the entire framework of the occupation collapsed under intergalactic law. "What did you do with it?" "Got it out," he said, and his voice had the flat finality of someone who had rehearsed the short version of a longer story many times. "Before they threw me in, the data's out there somewhere. I just can't reach it from down here." He gestured at the communications array. "Yet." She looked at the array, looked at him, looked at the map on the wall. "You've been building a transmitter," she said. "Trying to. The problem is range. The canyon walls block everything. The mineral composition is half the issue. The depth is the other half. I can generate signal. I can't get it past 300 meters of magnetite and compressed basalt." He sat down across from her with the ease of a man in his own living room, if his living room happened to be a cavern 2 kilometers below the surface of an occupied world. "What I need is an amplifier. The right kind. Which, as luck would have it, is the kind of technology the Vethkara throw in with their political prisoners." She looked at herself, at the collar they'd put on her before the throwing, a standard suppressor device, designed to block bioluminescent signaling, the kind they always used for Convergence House members, because the old caste had ways of communicating outside Vethkara monitoring frequencies. The collar was, among its other components, an extraordinarily powerful signal amplifier. She touched it. "You need my collar," she said. "I need your collar," he agreed, "but only if you're willing to give it. I'm not taking anything." He said this simply, without performance. "You decide what you're willing to risk and what you're not. Down here you're not anyone's subject or prisoner or property. Down here you're just a person who survived the drop." She was quiet for a moment. Outside the cavern, outside the light, in the breathing dark of the canyon, she could hear the distant sound of the underground river they'd both fallen into. It moved through the deep stone with a low, constant murmur, like a voice just below the range of intelligibility. The canyon exhaled above them. Somewhere up there, her mother's murderers were voting on her people's future. "Down here," she said, "do you have a plan?" He smiled. It was the first full smile she'd seen him produce, and it sat on his face in a way that made her understand something about humans she hadn't understood from the academic study of them. They smiled differently when they were being honest. All the careful, diplomatic expressions she'd seen on human faces at negotiating tables and press briefings had a particular quality of management. This didn't. This was the smile of a man who had been alone in the dark for 14 months building something that might not work, and who had just been handed a component he'd been trying to improvise. "I always have a plan," he said. "The plan just changes a lot." The first part of the plan was medical. He set her wrist with materials from the medical cache, not human medicine mostly, because he'd run out of that in the first 3 months, but Vethkara pharmaceutical salvage that he'd taught himself to use by trial and error over a long time. He explained what each thing was and what it would do, and waited for her consent before he did anything, which she noted carefully. The Vethkara medical staff who'd processed her before the execution had not done this. Neither had the human medics she'd seen in the occupation clinics. "Your people make good analgesics," he said, working on the splint. "The molecular chain is almost identical to something we had before the occupation. I keep thinking either we developed the same solution to pain independently, or one of us stole it from the other a long time ago." "More likely the latter," she said. The painkiller was working, and she felt her shoulders drop from their locked position. "Your world was on the survey map before the official first contact. We had independent assessment teams." "I know," he didn't say it bitterly. "The collar goes on first, right? Signal blockers before the greeting party." "That isn't policy. That was specific to Convergence House. I know." He tied off the splint. "Your caste opposed the expansion. Your people have been transmitting warnings to the target worlds for 200 years. That's why they throw Convergence members in here specifically. It's not just political. It's that you have the capability to undo what the expansion does. He looked at her. How many did you warn before they shut you down? She met his eyes. His eyes were a color her species called deep amber, which was associated in Convergence cultural tradition with things that lasted, stone, old wood, the kind of light that didn't go out. 47 systems, she said. Over 6 generations of my family's work. My mother's generation warned 23 alone. Including this one. A pause. No, she said. We were too late for this one. The assessment was already complete when we got the data. We sent the warning anyway. There was no one to receive it. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I received it. She looked at him sharply. Not directly, he said. But about 9 months ago, a data packet came through a channel I'd managed to tap into from down here. Scrambled pretty hard. I spent 2 months decoding it. He stood and crossed to a section of wall she hadn't examined yet, a compact data storage unit, clearly scavenged but carefully maintained. It was in 3rd Convergence cipher, which I don't speak fluently, but I recognized the pattern from the materials they'd thrown in with earlier political prisoners. He touched the unit. It was your mother's voice. The air went out of her. She sent it through a Convergence relay 3 months before she died, he said. I don't know if she knew you'd end up here, but she addressed part of it as though she expected someone from the house would eventually find it. He pulled back. I can play it for you whenever you're ready. There's no urgency. She didn't say anything for a long time. The river murmured somewhere in the dark. The canyon breathed. Later, she said finally, tell me about the transmitter first. Tell me the plan. He told her. The plan was, in rough architecture, this. The evidence Decker had smuggled out before his disposal was sitting in a distributed data network. A human-built one, illegal under occupation law, maintained by a loose association of survey technicians, researchers, and what he called, without apparent self-consciousness, people who are very annoyed about the situation. The network had been trying to broadcast the evidence to a relay point far enough outside Vethkara monitoring range to reach intergalactic legal channels. They had the data. They couldn't get it out. From the surface. The canyon walls that blocked signal from reaching up also blocked Vethkara monitoring from reaching down. He had spent 14 months mapping the precise geometry of the interference patterns, the pockets and channels and angles where signal could be threaded through the magnetite layers. He had found one, a thin corridor of conductivity running northeast through the canyon wall at a 43-degree angle, exiting approximately 600 meters above current surface level on the canyon's far eastern face. Which was, of course, still inside the canyon, but the Vethkara didn't monitor inside the canyon. Nobody monitored inside the canyon. As far as the Vethkara were concerned, the canyon was a disposal site. Nothing broadcast from a disposal site. If he could aim a signal through that corridor at sufficient strength to reach the relay point 50 kilometers northeast, a signal from deep underground, from inside the swallowing place, from the one location no one was listening, it would arrive at the network without any monitoring footprint at all. He needed the collar. More specifically, he needed the collar's amplification core, a piece of Convergence biotech that operated on a frequency band the Vethkara hadn't thought to monitor, because they didn't use it themselves, and that was powerful enough to punch through 600 meters of magnetite-dense basalt. And then, she asked, then the network broadcasts the evidence to a neutral sector relay. The relay logs it with the Intergalactic Legal Registry. The occupation's territorial claim fails legal review. He said this with the same flat calm he'd used to describe the medical supplies and the water filtration system. The Vethkara lose the legal right to be here. They don't leave peacefully, they never do, but it gives the resistance a framework, and it opens the door to intervention from the neutral sectors. That takes time, she said. A lot of time, years probably, maybe a decade. People will die in that decade. Yes, he said this without flinching or softening it. They will, but fewer than in a permanent occupation with no legal challenge and no hope of intervention. She turned the logic over. She had been taught, her entire life, the particular convergence calculus of long games and slow resistance, the understanding that the work her family did would not save everyone, might not save anyone in any visible time frame, but had to be done anyway because the alternative was simply watching. She recognized the shape of Decker's thinking. It was alien to her in its human particularity, but the architecture was familiar. "How do we get the collar off without the suppressor key?" she asked. "I've been working on that for 9 months, he said. He picked up what looked like a piece of carefully shaped stone with a metallic core. "Since I got your mother's message and started thinking that someone with convergence access would end up down here eventually." She looked at him. "You've been waiting for me," she said. "I've been waiting for someone," he said. "I hoped it would be you. The math on Convergence House survival was getting bad." Getting the collar off took 6 hours and produced 3 small burns on her neck from the suppressor field going unstable during the removal. Decker talked her through most of it, his hands doing the technical work, her bioluminescent glands providing a light source better than any chemical rod. Their 2 kinds of expertise meeting at the collar's interface points like a puzzle, assembled from pieces that had never been designed to fit together. When it came free, she felt the suppressor field drop like a weight leaving her skull. Her cast markings flared, all 6 spiraling lines brightening to full gold output simultaneously, the cavern walls going amber, and Decker sitting back on his heels and looking at her like she'd just lit up. "Your record said Convergence members were dangerous," he said. "I understand the collar now. What do my records say we can do?" "Communicate through biological signaling channels the Vethkara can't block or monitor." He considered her. "Is that all?" She held up her undamaged right hand and let the bioluminescent output concentrate in her palm. Something she'd been doing since childhood. The way children everywhere practice the things that feel like magic until they understand it isn't. The light gathered and focused, and she saw him clock it, the precise controlled intensity of it, the way it wasn't just illumination. "Data encoding," she said. "We can encode data in bioluminescent pulses at a rate and complexity that Vethkara instruments can't decode. It was how Convergence sent messages before they developed the cipher technology." She let the light disperse. "If we transmit the evidence packet through the amplification core, but wrap the transmission in a bioluminescent encoding layer, using my output as the carrier wave. The Vethkara monitoring instruments wouldn't recognize it as data," he said. His voice had changed, the same alertness she'd seen when he smiled, but different now, pulled forward into something more urgent. "They'd read it as biological noise, cave bioluminescence." "There's a great deal of bioluminescence in deep cave systems," she agreed. "It's a documented natural phenomenon across 40% of known worlds." He was already moving toward the transmitter array. She followed. They worked for 11 hours. She did not think about her mother's voice waiting in the data unit. She thought about the work. The work was something she could hold: circuits and frequencies, and the particular challenge of interfacing Convergence biotech with salvaged Vethkara components and human-built infrastructure, using tools that had been improvised from 2.5 years of combined ingenuity. Decker worked the way she suspected he did everything. Steadily, without drama, with a focused attention that didn't waver even when the work went wrong, and it went wrong several times. The 3rd time a component failed and he had to rebuild the coupling from scratch, she asked him, "Why didn't you give up?" "When?" "Any of it, when they threw you in. When the first transmitter attempt failed, when was that?" "Month 4. "When the second one failed?" Month 8. Why didn't you decide it wasn't possible? He was quiet for a moment, not because the question was difficult, but because he was deciding whether the answer was something he wanted to say or just something he knew. There was a moment, he said finally, month 6, I think, when I'd been down here long enough that I knew the surface people had written me off. The network had gone quiet, turned out they'd had to relocate twice, and I hadn't had any outside contact in 2 months, and I did this calculation. He didn't look up from the coupling. Probability of success. Accounted for everything I knew. My resources, my timeline, the interference patterns, the monitoring gaps. Came out at 4.7%. That's very low. It's not 0, he said. That's the number that matters. 4.7 isn't 0. 0 means it's over. 4.7 means you keep working. She thought about her mother. 47 systems warned over 6 generations, and her mother had died in a room designed to look like a natural death. In a fight she'd known she was likely to lose for at least a decade, warning a world she'd been told she was too late for anyway. She thought about the data packet in the storage unit. Her mother's voice, encoded and waiting in the dark of the swallowing place, addressed to whoever from the house would eventually fall in. Her mother had known she might die before she could get the message out herself. She had sent it to the canyon, trusted it to the dark and the river, and whatever strange chance had left a human surveyor alive in the deep stone with the patience to decode a convergent cipher. 4.7, Velsathai said, and picked up the coupling component and helped him finish the rebuild. At the 15th hour, Decker said, "It's ready." He didn't say it with flourish. He said it the way you say things when you've been working toward them for 14 months, and you've run the numbers enough times that certainty feels less like excitement and more like weight. "The corridor," she said. "The signal path, you're sure about the geometry." "Mapped it over 6 months using echo analysis and resonance testing. I'm sure." He paused. "I'm sure about the path, the amplification strength with the collar core I'm estimating. I've never had a component this powerful to work with." "What's the margin for error?" "The signal will either punch through or it won't. If it does, the encoding layer should make it look like background bionoise to any monitoring that catches the edge bleed. If it doesn't punch through, we try again. I have enough power stored for 3 attempts. And if all 3 fail, then I redesign the coupling and we wait for more material." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not running out of plans." She nodded. "Do it," she said. He initiated the sequence. The cavern filled with a low hum, not loud, more felt than heard, a vibration in the stone under her feet. Her cast markings flared automatically in response to the amplification field, which was what they'd designed the system to do. Her bioluminescent output, synchronized to the data packet's timing, wrapping the transmission in a carrier wave that no Vethkara instrument would read as anything but cave noise. She held both hands out, palms up, and let the light come. It came fully and completely in a way it hadn't since childhood, before she'd learned to keep it contained and managed and appropriate for court settings. It flooded the cavern in gold, 3 meters, 5, bouncing off Decker's carefully mapped walls and his salvaged equipment and the hand-drawn cartography that covered every available surface, and she thought, this is what they were afraid of, not the encoding, not the political opposition. This, the light that's been here the whole time waiting. The hum built. She heard the transmitter working, a sound like something very large and very patient finally speaking after a long silence. Then it stopped. Not with a crash or a failure sound. Just the cessation of the hum, the gradual fading of the amplification field, her markings dimming back to resting levels. The normal dark of the cavern reasserting itself, interrupted only by his chemical lights and the faint amber glow of her resting output. Decker checked 3 different instruments. He checked them again. "It went," he said. They didn't know if it worked for a long time. That was the nature of the plan. The signal went out and then you waited, because the network was distributed and slow and operating under occupation law and had to be careful. You waited and you kept building, because there was always more to build, and because 4.7 wasn't zero and the work didn't stop just because you'd hit a milestone. She listened to her mother's message on the third day. She listened to it alone in the far corner of the cavern, while Decker worked on an expansion to the water filtration that he'd been planning since before she arrived. He didn't ask her what was in it afterward, and she didn't tell him that night. But later, a week later, when they were mapping a new section of the sublevel, and she was getting comfortable enough in the dark to trust her footing without thinking about it, she said, "My mother knew about you, specifically." He stopped. "Not by name," she said, "but she had data on the survey technicians who'd been disposed of in the expansion zones. She tracked the ones who went into the swallowing place. She sent the message to the canyon because she knew there was a 41% chance that one of the humans they disposed of was still alive and building something." She paused. 41 was high enough in her math. He was quiet for a moment. "What did she say about them?" "The survey technicians she tracked. She said they were the kind of people who couldn't stop working on a problem even when the problem was working on them." She looked at him in the dim light. She said it with admiration. It was the same language she used for Convergence members who kept sending warnings to worlds they'd already lost. He didn't answer immediately. When he did, he said, "She sounds like she was worth listening to." "Yes," Velsathe said, "she was." They kept mapping. The response came on the 42nd day. Not dramatically. It came through the data tap as a compressed packet with a neutral sector header, and Decker had to spend 4 hours decoding it before they knew what it said. Velsathe sat beside him through the decoding without pretending to have patience she didn't feel, asking questions when she could help and staying quiet when she couldn't. What it said when the decoding was finished. The evidence had been logged with the Intergalactic Legal Registry. A formal inquiry had been opened. Under the terms of the Neutral Sector Accord, Vethkara expansion operations in the star system were placed under provisional halt pending review. The halt was not an end. Decker had been correct that this would take years, possibly decades, and people would die in the interim, but it was real. It was on the record. It had weight. At the bottom of the packet, in the human network's own communication format, "Thank you. We thought you were gone. Are you alive down there?" He typed back one-handed, while she read over his shoulder. "Alive, not alone, still working." She thought about her mother, who had sent a message to a canyon in the hope that someone was still breathing at the bottom of it and still building. She thought about 63 tallied bodies and the 64th who hit water instead of stone. She thought about 4.7% and the specific human conviction that not zero was the only number that mattered. She added below his words, in third convergence cipher, "Tell them the house is not finished." He looked at the addition, looked at her. "They'll figure out the cipher," he said. "They have someone in the network who can read third convergence," she said. "I checked your translation notes. You got about 80% of my mother's message. The person who taught you was better. Archivist in the northern sector. She's been under occupation monitoring for 2 years. She'll know what the house cipher means when it comes through." He nodded. He sent it. They stayed in the canyon. Not forever, but for long enough that the word "stay" stopped feeling like a temporary condition and started feeling like a choice they were making repeatedly, daily, each time the alternatives presented themselves and they turned back to the work instead. The canyon was not safe. It had never been safe, but the Vethkara had decided it was nothing, and the thing about being declared nothing was that no one was watching you. They mapped the entire sublevel system over the following months. Velsathe's bioluminescent output turned out to be extraordinarily useful for geological mapping. There were formations at depth that responded to particular frequencies of her light, fluorescing in patterns that Decker's instruments had never been able to detect. She started making notes. He started integrating the notes into the cartography. The map on the eastern wall grew. More transmissions went out, more came back. The legal process ground forward with the particular pace of things that move slowly but don't stop. And the network grew, carefully, under monitoring pressure, with the losses that growth under pressure always produces. And the evidence Decker had buried at the cost of his surface life worked its way through the channels and registers and formal structures of intergalactic law. The occupation didn't end. Not quickly. But things changed at the edges where change was possible, and then the edges moved inward, the way edges do when pressure is consistent and time is long. On the 1-year anniversary of Velsathiz's arrival, which she knew only approximately, because days in the canyon were a question of work cycles more than light, she told him about the Convergence's full archive. Not the incomplete records the Vethkara had seized. The actual archive, which had been distributed through a relay system across 47 systems, encoded in third convergent cipher, waiting. Waiting for what? He asked. For the House to authorize retrieval, she said. I'm the senior living member of the third convergence. I can authorize it. He looked at her steadily for a moment. What's in it? 200 years of documentation, she said. Every expansion, every world. Every system the Vethkara targeted, the methods they used, the legal vulnerabilities in their territorial claims, and the evidence we collected from every one of those 47 warnings. She let her markings brighten slightly, not display, just the involuntary illumination that happened when she felt something clearly. It's enough to challenge not just this occupation, every occupation, going back 160 years. He didn't say anything for a long time. The river moved in the dark beyond the cavern, the canyon breathed. The chemical lights, replaced now with something better that they'd built together from salvage and ingenuity, turned the organized space of base camp into something that had gradually, over the months, become less like a survival installation and more like something they simply lived in. That's not a legal inquiry, he said finally. That's a case. Yes. That takes decades. Yes. People will die in those decades. Yes, she held his eyes, but fewer than if the case is never made. The math holds. He thought about it the way he thought about everything, not performing deliberation, just actually doing it, running the numbers, testing the structure of the logic against what he knew. She'd learned to recognize the difference between the two in humans. The gap between displayed consideration and actual consideration was, she thought, smaller in him than in almost any other person she'd known. Okay, he said, show me the archive. She showed him. They started building something new. The Vethkara had a record of 64 beings thrown into the swallowing place. They did not update it. Why would they? The swallowing place swallowed things. That was what it did. The people they threw in were gone from sight, gone from consequence, gone from the calculations that the expansion made every morning when it counted its victories and moved to the next column of numbers. Down in the dark, below the magnetite walls and the breathing vapor and the cold underground river that had, in some ways, saved everything. A human who couldn't stop working on a problem, and a princess whose people had spent 200 years warning worlds they'd been told, were already lost sat across a hand-drawn map that now covered 3 walls, and built, and transmitted, and waited for the slow machinery of law and record and human stubbornness and convergence patience to do the work that couldn't be done quickly. The canyon exhaled. The lights held. The work continued. Somewhere in the northeast, 50 kilometers from the swallowing place, a signal arrived at a relay point every few weeks, wrapped in bioluminescent encoding, dressed as cave noise, invisible to the instruments of the people who had decided that invisibility was the same as gone. They were wrong about a lot of things, the Vethkara, but that was the one that would cost them most. Not the legal inquiry, not the formal challenges, not the decades-long unraveling of occupation law that had already quietly, without announcement, begun. The thing that would cost them most was simpler than any of that. They had thrown the wrong person into the wrong canyon at the wrong time, and the person already waiting at the bottom had been down there long enough to be ready. 4.7% isn't zero. It never was. She had begun to understand the canyon on its own terms. In the first week she treated it as enemy terrain, the darkness something to be endured, the breathing stone something to be navigated despite itself, the depth a condition imposed from outside. But Decker had been down here long enough that he'd developed a different relationship with the place, and it transferred, the way useful perspectives do, through observation and proximity. He knew which walls were stable and which had micro-fractures that would worsen with temperature changes. He knew where the underground river widened into a pool deep enough for washing. He knew the precise sound the canyon made before a pressure shift, a low harmonic just below the threshold of conscious hearing that you felt more in your chest than your ears. And he'd been waiting for it the first time she'd heard it, watching her expression change from confused to concerned to understanding. 20 minutes, he said that first time, then a pressure drop, air gets strange, stay away from the North Tunnel. She stayed away from the North Tunnel. 18 minutes later, a column of cold air moved through the upper caverns with enough force to douse an unshielded light source. She heard it from base camp, felt the temperature drop through 3 sets of stone walls. He'd known it was coming. How, she asked. The sound, he said. Took me about 6 weeks to consciously register it, but my body figured it out before my brain did, woke up on the right nights, started moving to better positions before I understood why. He shrugged. You'll do it too, give it a month. She did. 3 weeks and 4 days, actually, which she suspected was faster than his estimate and didn't say so. The canyon had its own logic. That was what she came to understand. It was not hostile. It was simply indifferent, which was different and in some ways safer. Hostile things were trying to harm you. Indifferent things were just being what they were. You could learn indifferent things. You could negotiate with natural law in a way you couldn't negotiate with malice. The Vethkara were malice. The canyon was just deep. She started mapping the sections he hadn't reached. The sublevel extended further east than his original estimates, and the geology shifted from dense magnetite-heavy basalt to something lighter, more porous, with a different crystal structure that her bioluminescent output interacted with in ways she didn't yet have language for. The walls in the eastern sections didn't just fluoresce. They responded different frequencies producing different patterns, as though the mineral structure had preferences. She brought Decker the first samples. He looked at them for a long time without speaking. This is what I found, he said finally. Before they threw me in, this mineral composition, not exactly, this is deeper than the survey site, but the same family of formation. He turned the sample in the light. The prior habitation evidence wasn't structures or artifacts, it was this, engineered mineral systems. Somebody changed the geology of this world on purpose. He set the sample down carefully. A long time ago, a very long time. How long? Conservative estimate from the isotope analysis I could do with what I had down here, 40,000 years, minimum. She did the math. 40,000 years before present meant 40,000 years before the Vethkara had any territorial claim to the region. Under intergalactic law, the threshold for recognized prior civilization was 10,000 years. This isn't just a challenge to the expansion protocol, she said. No, he said. It's evidence that someone was here long enough and advanced enough to engineer the bedrock, which means territorial rights in the star system were never the Vethkara's to claim, which means the occupation was illegal from the first survey. He looked up at her. Not contestable, not subject to review, Illegal, past tense already. Everything they've done here was done under false right. She understood the legal distinction. Illegal from inception meant no grandfather provisions, no negotiated transition, no slow unraveling over decades. It meant removal, complete, mandated, non-negotiable removal, once the evidence was properly documented and filed. It meant her mother's work, all of it, all 200 years of it, had been building toward a case that could be made now completely with this. "We need better documentation of the eastern sublevel," she said. "Yes. We need to transmit the geological data separately. The legal filing will need it as a distinct evidentiary package." "Yes. We're going to need to be down here longer," she said. "Yes." He picked up the sample again. "How are you with that?" She looked around the base camp, the map on 3 walls, the water filtration, the food cultivation under its UV strips, the communications array that had already sent 17 transmissions and received 11 responses and was, right now, processing an incoming packet from the network that they decode together after dinner. She thought about the surface, the court she'd grown up in, which was gone, the political structure she'd been trained to operate within, which was hollowed, the civilization she was technically a princess of, which had been eroding under occupation pressure for long enough that princess meant something different now than it had when the title was assigned to her. She thought about 47 worlds, 200 years, her mother's voice patient in the dark. "I'm fine with it," she said. She was. The documentation of the eastern sublevel took 4 months. During those 4 months, 3 more transmissions out, 2 responses in, 1 contact with a resistance network outside the Northern Territory that Decker had been attempting to establish for months, and that finally came through on a frequency she identified by sound after 3 weeks of listening to the signals he hadn't been able to decode. 3rd convergence cipher, 2nd variant. Someone else from the house had survived. 2 sections of the North Tunnel had to be rerouted around structural instability. She fell once, not far, 2 meters onto a stable ledge, bruising her right hip significantly but breaking nothing. He fell once in the same week, a full 5 meters into the river, coming up cold and swearing in a language she didn't recognize. She fished him out with the rope system they'd installed after her first fall, and he sat on the ledge dripping and said, with the specific dignity of a man refusing to be embarrassed, "That was the 4th tunnel section, which I stand by as the more treacherous one, and I want that noted." "Noted," she said. "Thank you." She noted it in the map log, which she'd started keeping as a formal document. Geological data, structural observations, incident records. Partly because the data was valuable, partly because keeping formal records was something Convergence members did instinctively, the habit of a civilization that had survived by documenting everything carefully and distributing the documentation widely enough that no single destruction could end it. Decker kept his own records. Less formal, field notes in a cramped handwriting she'd spent 2 months learning to read, but comprehensive in a different way. His records had editorials in the margins. Observations about what the formations made him think about, what the day had felt like, what particular challenge had given him the most trouble, and what approach had finally worked. She read them when he was asleep and thought about the difference between their 2 kinds of documentation. Hers built for the archive, his built for the person coming behind to understand what it had been like to be present. Both kinds were necessary. She'd known that abstractly her whole life. She knew it specifically now. The complete evidentiary package went out on a clear signal day in the canyon's 8th month of her presence. Geological data, archive authorization, legal filings, and a full transmission of her mother's original documentation encoded in the bioluminescent carrier wave. She held her hands up for 6 hours straight. Decker watched her output the data with an attention she recognized as the particular human quality she'd come to think of as bearing witness, not passive observation but active presence, a decision to be there fully and completely for something that mattered. He didn't speak during the transmission. Didn't need to. His presence in the cavern was its own kind of signal, the same frequency it had always been, alive, still working, not alone. When the last packet went through, and her markings dimmed back to resting levels, and she lowered her hands, which had begun to shake in the last hour, he crossed the cavern and put a mug of hot water with something dried and bitter steeped in it into her hands without being asked, which was something he'd started doing when he noticed that she needed it before she noticed it herself. She drank. "That's all of it," she said. "Yes. Whatever happens next." "The work continues," he said. "Different shape, same work." She nodded. She drank the rest of the bitter water. She looked at the map covering 3 walls of the cavern, the cartography of a place the Vethkara had decided was nothing, mapped by 2 people they'd decided were finished. 4.7, she said. "Not even close to 0, he agreed. Outside, the canyon breathed. Inside, the light held steady. The map grew, and the signal that had already gone moved through the geology of an occupied world toward the relay point in the northeast, wrapped in bioluminescent gold, dressed as the cave noise of deep natural places, invisible to every monitoring system the occupation had trained on the surface. They were looking at the wrong things. They always were. Word arrived 6 weeks later. Not through the data tap, through a different channel entirely, one Decker hadn't even known existed until the signal broke through the eastern sublevel corridor at a frequency he recognized as human-built, but didn't know which networks. It took him 2 days to decode the handshake and confirm it wasn't a Vethkara probe. When he did, the message was short. Filing accepted, review panel convened, provisional halt extended to full sector. They're asking about the source. They want to know if there are survivors in the canyon. He read it to her. She listened with her hands flat on her knees and her eyes closed, and her cast markings at a brightness he'd learned to read as the equivalent of someone very still on the inside of something very large. Then she said, "Tell them yes." He sent it. "Are there survivors in the canyon?" "Yes, too." The response came back in 4 hours, which was fast, faster than the legal channels moved, which meant someone on that end was waiting, had been waiting, was watching the channel. "Can you get out?" He looked at her, she looked at him. They looked at the map, at the 14 months of careful geometry Decker had plotted into the eastern wall's cartography, the interference patterns, the conductor channels, the structural surveys, at the route that had emerged from all of it over the past few months. Not vertical, because vertical was impossible, but diagonal, following the porous eastern geological shift, up through the crystal-structured formations that Velsathize's bioluminescent output could navigate because they responded to her light. Not a climb, a path. A long one. Difficult. Possible. "We weren't planning to leave yet," she said. "The documentation isn't complete." "No," he agreed. "But a live witness is worth more than a complete archive." She thought about her mother, who had never been a live witness, who had sent her voice to the dark and trusted the dark to find something worth trusting, who had made her choices based on the math of what moved the situation forward, even when forward felt like nothing. "The eastern route," she said. 7 days if the formations hold, he said. "The upper crystal section is the variable. My output will navigate the crystal section." "Yes," he paused. "You've done it in sections, not end-to-end." "Then we do it end-to-end." She stood. She looked at the cavern, the home it had become, the map, the careful built systems of 2 people who couldn't stop working on problems. She would leave the map. It was too large to carry. But she documented it, recorded it, encoded every data point into the archive. The map would come with them in the only form that mattered. "When do we go?" she asked. "How long do you need?" She thought about what there was to take, what couldn't be left, what the next phase of the work would require from them that the canyon phase hadn't. 6 hours, she said. "Give me 6 hours to pack what we need." He nodded. He started his own preparations. In the data unit, he sent the response. "Working on it, give us 7 days." They went up through the eastern stone. 7 days. The crystal formations responded to her bioluminescent output the way the map surveys had predicted, brightening, offering refracted pathlight, turning the geology into something almost cooperative. She went first in the narrow sections, her hands flat on the walls, letting the light spread, and the formations showed them the way as though the engineer who'd built them 40,000 years ago had known, somehow, that the answer to this question would look like this. A human who refused to die, and a princess of a vanishing house, navigating ancient stone together by the light of something that couldn't be blocked or monitored or suppressed. Decker climbed behind her and didn't complain and didn't look down. On the 5th day they reached the crystal section, the most variable part, the formation he'd been uncertain about. She put her hands on the walls and poured full output into them, both hands, full intensity, the kind she'd produced in the base camp cavern when the transmitter fired, and the stone answered. She wasn't sure how to describe it except that. The formations lit up in a cascade, one activating the next, in a chain that followed a specific path through the dense crystal lattice, a path that hadn't been visible before she lit it and was unmistakable once she did. A road. Someone had built a road through here, 40,000 years ago. Through the crystal section of what would become the swallowing place, someone had engineered a path that a bioluminescent being could follow by putting their hands on the walls and letting the light go. She stood in the lit path and thought, my mother knew. Not specifically, not the crystal road or the canyon or Marcus Decker in the dark, but she had known that the Convergence's 200 years of work would eventually come to a moment when what had been built was enough, when the accumulated documentation and resistance and patience reached critical structure and became something that couldn't be undone. She'd known her daughter might be the one standing in that moment. She'd sent her voice to the dark anyway, just in case. "What is it?" Decker said from just behind her. "Someone left us a path," she said. "The engineered formations." "Yes, but I think it was built for this. For someone like me to navigate it." She looked at the lit road ahead, unspooling through the crystal section toward daylight she could feel as a change in air pressure, still distant. 40,000 years ago, someone built an exit. He was quiet for a moment. "That's a long time to wait for someone to use it," he said. "Yes," she said, "it is." She started walking. They came out on the eastern face of the canyon on the morning of the 7th day. Not into sunlight. It was early, the sun just cresting the ridge to the east, the sky the particular gray gold of planetary mornings that looked the same in this system as in her home system, which she noted and did not mention. The air tasted of surface, wind and open space, and the particular combination of atmospheric components that living things in cave systems became aware of as an absence before they become aware of it as a thing. She stood at the canyon's edge and breathed the open air for the first time in however many months it had been. Decker stood beside her. He looked at the horizon for a long time. 14 months underground, she said. What does the surface look like to you? Loud, he said, too much happening at once. He paused, also very good. She laughed. She hadn't laughed much in the canyon, not because it was a joyless place, but because laughter required a certain surplus, and surplus had been rationed. But it came now, unexpectedly in the open air at the top of the swallowing place, and she let it. From somewhere in the northeast, carried on the morning wind, which had the right conditions, which Decker had known about because he'd mapped the wind patterns the same way he'd mapped everything else. A signal chirped from the communications device he'd carried up out of the dark on his back. He looked at the screen. Contact confirmed. Extraction team positioned 12 kilometers northeast. Can you move? He showed her. She looked at it, looked at the canyon behind them, at the dark edge of the exit they'd come through, the eastern face they'd climbed for 7 days, the top of the swallowing place in morning light. 64 thrown in, 2 walked out. Yes, she said. We can move. He scented. They moved. Behind them, the canyon exhaled, its long, perpetual sigh of vapor and deep stone, the breath of the swallowing place that the Vethkara had taken for permanent silence. They were wrong about silence. They'd been wrong about a great many things. The work continued.